The biostatic equilibrium of the Argent Spire was, in my professional opinion, a miracle held together by spit, prayers, and my refusal to take a day off. I had spent the last 7 hours elbow deep in the sludge of a grade C nutrient recycler, listening to the rhythmic hum of the fusion core and the distant, muffled thrum of a party I was definitely not supposed to attend. Yet here I was, squeezed into a formal tunic that felt like it was woven from fiberglass and social anxiety, standing in the grand atrium while Ouroboros loomed outside the viewport like a giant, swirling marble of gold and violet gas. My supervisor, a man whose lung capacity was matched only by his ability to delegate misery, had practically threatened to eject me into the vacuum if I did not show face. "The brass needs to see we have humans who can handle more than a wrench, Vance," he had barked. "Show them you are refined. Tell them the bioscrubbers are at 98% efficiency. Do not mention the leak in Sector 9. I adjusted my collar, feeling the stiff fabric chafe against the scar on my neck. A souvenir from a ruptured steam pipe 3 years ago. The grand atrium was a fever dream of interstellar vanity. High-ranking delegates from a dozen systems glided across the floors of polished obsidian. There were the Thraxians, whose chitinous carapaces glittered under the artificial sunlight, and the luminescents, who drifted like sentient neon clouds, their colors shifting with every polite syllable of trade talk. I felt like a grease-stained thumb in a room full of diamonds. My drink, a neon blue concoction that tasted like industrial coolant and broken dreams, was getting warm in my hand. I watched the servers, sleek silver drones, weaving through the crowd with the grace of predatory fish. I considered the probability of me slipping out through the service hatch behind the buffet table. I estimated it at 65%, rising to 80% if I waited for the next diplomatic toast. That was when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the royal dais, surrounded by a phalanx of guards whose armor looked more like jewelry than protection. She was Xylosian, the race that sat at the very top of the biostandard. They were tall, pale, and moved with a terrifyingly fluid precision. Her hair was a river of silver that seemed to catch the ambient light and hold it hostage. Her ears were long and swept back, tipped with delicate, translucent cartilage that shimmered. She looked bored. Not the kind of boredom you feel when waiting for a bus, but the deep, existential fatigue of someone who had heard the same 3 lies in 4 different languages for the last century. I was staring. I knew I was staring. My brain, usually a finely tuned instrument of mechanical logic, had decided to stall like an old turbine. She turned her head then, her eyes irises the color of a dying star, scanning the room with a cold, analytical detachment, and then her gaze locked onto mine. Panic is a funny thing. It bypasses the cerebral cortex and goes straight to the primitive parts of the soul. My mind screamed at me to do something normal, something human, something that didn't involve looking like a frozen statue. So I did the only thing I could think of. I smiled. It wasn't a good smile. My facial nerves don't work quite right on the left side thanks to that steam pipe incident. It was a lopsided, awkward, slightly nervous twitch of a grin, the kind you give to a coworker when you've accidentally used their labeled creamer in the break room. It was a smile of shared misery, a silent acknowledgement between 2 people who were currently being held hostage by polite society. Her reaction was instantaneous. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were nothing but black voids. Her posture shifted, her spine straightening as if she had been hit by a high-voltage current. She didn't look away. She didn't look offended. She looked found. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned on my heel, nearly knocked over a Thraxian diplomat, and made a beeline for the exit. I didn't stop until I reached the familiar, grease-scented sanctuary of the maintenance tunnels. I stripped off the tunic, threw it into a recycling bin, and spent the rest of the night checking the pressure valves in Sector 4. The machines made sense. The machines didn't have eyes like dying stars. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment of social weirdness, ships passing in the night, or more accurately, a majestic starship passing a derelict freighter. I went to bed at 2400 hours, convinced that the universe was still in its proper alignment. I was wrong. The universe had drifted 3 kilometers off course, and I was about to hit the reef. The sound of an alarm in the maintenance quarters usually means one of two things. Either the station is losing atmospheric pressure, or someone had a catastrophic accident with the coffee synthesizer. I woke up at 0600 to a sound that was neither. It was a chime, polite, persistent, and terrifyingly high priority. I rolled out of my bunk, my joints protesting the sudden movement, and tapped the display on my terminal. My vision was still blurry, but I could see the official seal of the Argent Spire Command. Kalen Vance, Maintenance Tech, 3rd Class, please report to the diplomatic wing for immediate processing. Processing? That was a word they used for hazardous waste or new recruits. I rubbed my face, feeling the stubble on my chin. Maybe they found out about the leak in Sector 9, I muttered to myself. Maybe the supervisor finally realized I'd been using spare parts from the scrap heap to keep the scrubbers running. I dressed in my standard-issue gray jumpsuit, the one with the permanent oil stain on the left thigh, and headed toward the upper decks. The station felt different this morning. People were whispering in the corridors. Even the maintenance bots seemed to be buzzing with more urgency than usual. I arrived at the coffee station in the main concourse, desperate for enough caffeine to face whatever reprimand was coming my way. 2 engineers from the electrical team were huddled over a tablet, their voices hushed. "Did you hear?" one of them asked, his eyes wide. "Princess Serene made the declaration last night, at the gala." The other one shook his head. "After 5 decades of searching? Who is he? Some prince from the Andromeda cluster? A high-gen noble?" "No," the first one replied, stifling a laugh. "That's the crazy part. They're saying he's a local, a human, some guy named Vance." I froze, the coffee bulb halfway to my mouth. The hot liquid sloshed against my hand, but I didn't feel it. My heart was suddenly trying to exit my chest through my throat. "Vance," I whispered to the empty air. I turned around, intending to bolt back to the sublevels and hide in a ventilation duct for the next 10 years. But 2 guards in silver and white armor were already standing behind me. They weren't station security. They were Xylosian Royal Guard. They were nearly 2 meters tall, their faces hidden behind masks of shimmering crystal. "Kalen Vance?" the one on the left asked. His voice was like a chime hitting silk. I swallowed hard. "Depends on who's asking. Is there a problem with the air filters in the Royal Suite? Because I submitted the report for the catalytic converters 3 days ago and—" The guards didn't let me finish. They stepped forward, one on each side, and gripped my arms. Their touch was surprisingly gentle, but possessed the strength of hydraulic presses. "The Arch-Consort-elect is required in the high chamber," the guard said. "The what?" I stammered, my legs feeling like they were made of gelatin. "Arch-Consort? Look, there's been a massive glitch in your database. I'm a maintenance tech. I fix things that smell bad. I am not a consort of anything, let alone an arch one." The guards didn't respond. They simply turned and began walking, dragging me along with them. We passed the coffee station, where the 2 engineers were now staring at me with expressions of pure, unadulterated shock. One of them actually dropped his tablet. We reached the diplomatic wing, a place I had only ever visited to repair the plumbing. The doors to the high chamber were 3 meters of solid platinum leaf, carved with the history of the Xylosian people. They slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, the room was bathed in the golden light of Ouroboros. Princess Serene was standing by the viewport, her back to the room. Her advisors, 3 elderly Xylosians with skin like crumpled parchment and eyes full of sharp disapproval, were clustered around a long table. "Your Highness, the lead advisor, a man named Valerius, said with a voice that could peel paint. The candidate has arrived." Serene turned around. She was no longer wearing the liquid midnight dress from the gala. She was in a simple white tunic that looked more like an engineer's smock than a royal garment. When she saw me, her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a resonance of that dying star. "Kalen," she said. I looked at the guards, then at the advisors, then back at her. "Your Highness, look, I think we need to talk about the concept of facial expressions. In my culture, a smile is often just a reflexive response to social discomfort. It's like a nervous tick. It doesn't mean I'm your soulmate. It doesn't even mean I like the music at your party." The advisors bristled. "The audacity," Valerius hissed. You speak to the blood of Xylos with the tongue of a scavenger? Leave us, Serene said, her voice quiet but absolute. The advisors looked like they wanted to argue, but one look from her sent them scurrying out of the room like startled rodents. The guards followed, the heavy doors closing with a thud that sounded an awful lot like the lid of a coffin. I stood there, alone in a room that cost more than my entire home planet's GDP, facing a woman who could probably have me vaporized with a snap of her fingers. Is it a lie? She asked, stepping toward me. She didn't walk. She drifted, her movements so smooth they defied the laws of friction. Is what a lie? The resonance I saw. The mirror glitch. She stopped just a meter away. I could smell something faint on her. Not perfume, but the ozone scent of a high-energy field. Among my people, we are born into a perfect symphony. We hear the thoughts of our kin, the rhythm of our world. But for some of us, there is a silence. I shifted my weight, my boots squeaking on the pristine floor. I'm pretty good at fixing silence. Usually involves a screwdriver and a bit of lubricant. I have spent 50 years in that silence, Serene continued, ignoring my attempt at humor, waiting for a frequency that matched mine. And then, across that room of preening nobles and lying diplomats, I saw you. Your smile. It wasn't a melody. It was a jagged, beautiful break in the music. It was a glitch. And in that glitch, I heard my own name. I looked at her, really looked at her. Up close, she didn't look like a goddess. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for a very long time. Princess, I'm a 0 rank. My genes are a mess. I have a scar on my neck and I'm pretty sure I have a permanent scent of recycled biomatter. You're looking for a hero, or a prince, or at least someone who knows which fork to use at dinner. I'm just the guy who keeps the lights on. The lights are the only thing that matters in the dark, she whispered. Before I could respond, the station's internal comms erupted. Alert. Security breach in Sector 7. Unauthorized docking in progress. Serene's face went pale. The traditionalists, she muttered. They didn't even wait for the formal protest. She grabbed my hand. Her skin was cool, but where our palms met, I felt a jolt of static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just a physical touch. For a split second, I saw a flash of a world with purple skies and silver oceans. I felt her loneliness, a vast echoing canyon of it. Wait, what's happening? I asked, the engineer in me finally taking control. Who is docking? People who believe that my choice of a consort should be determined by a laboratory, not a heartbeat, she said, pulling me toward a side exit. They are here to ensure that the glitch in the galaxy is corrected. Corrected? You mean killed? In diplomatic terms, yes. I looked at her hand in mine, then at the door where my certain, boring life used to be. Well, I said, a grim sort of humor taking over. I guess it's a good thing I brought my multi-tool. The sound of the breach was not the cinematic roar I had expected. Instead, it was a sickening, metallic crunch that vibrated through the floor plates of the diplomatic wing, followed by the high-pitched hiss of emergency atmospheric seals struggling to compensate for a pressure drop. My ears popped painfully. I looked at Serene, whose silver hair seemed to ripple like it was caught in an invisible current. She didn't look afraid. She looked profoundly disappointed, as if she had hoped her people were better than this. We need to move, I said, my voice sounding tight even to my own ears. If they've breached Sector 7, they've already bypassed the primary security grid. The station's internal sensors are going to be blind in 42 seconds when the automated override kicks in. You know this for a fact? She asked, her hand still locked around mine. Her grip was cold, steady, and strangely grounding. I'm the guy who wrote the override script, Princess. It's supposed to prevent a total systems collapse during a hull breach, but it also locks down the elevators and turns the corridors into a maze of blast doors. If we get caught in the main hallways, we're sitting ducks. I didn't wait for her to agree. I pulled her toward the service panel behind the royal dais, a discreet, platinum-plated hatch that most nobles probably thought was a decorative flourish. To me, it was the gateway to the only world where I actually had a fighting chance. I punched in a 14-digit maintenance code, and the panel slid open with a groan that suggested it hadn't been used since the station was commissioned 20 years ago. In, I whispered. unless you prefer staying here to argue the finer points of genetic purity with a boarding party of purifiers. Serene didn't hesitate. She stepped into the narrow, dimly lit shaft, her white tunic catching the grime of the walls. I followed, sliding the panel shut just as the heavy platinum doors of the high chamber were blown off their hinges with a localized sonic pulse. The sound was muffled by the insulation, but the vibration nearly knocked me off the ladder. Keep climbing, I urged. We need to drop down 3 levels to the secondary cooling trunk. It's tight, it's loud, and it smells like ozone and stagnant coolant, but the thermal signatures are so high in there that their scanners won't be able to pick us out from the machinery. We scrambled down the rungs for what felt like an eternity, the air growing warmer and thicker with every meter. I could hear the distant rhythmic thumping of heavy boots on the deck plates above us. The purifiers weren't just soldiers. They were elite Zelosian hunters, bio-augmented to track biological signatures across vast distances. If we stayed in the standard corridors, they'd have our scent in minutes. "Kalen," Serene whispered, her breath hitching. We were huddled on a narrow catwalk overlooking the massive, rotating turbines of the atmospheric processor. The roar was deafening, a subharmonic vibration that shook my very bones. My people, the traditionalists, they do not just want to stop the Union. They believe that my resonance with a human is a sign of a deeper corruption, a glitch in the royal lineage that must be excised. I looked at her. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the blue flicker of the turbines. Excised? You mean they think you're broken because you like my lopsided grin? They think I am broken because I am the first of the Ethelgard in 10 generations to be born with a silent soul. I cannot hear the collective anthem. I have lived my entire life in a void, pretending to hear the music that everyone else takes for granted. And then I saw you, and for the first time there was a sound. A jagged, messy, beautiful sound. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. So we're both glitches. Great. The princess who can't hear the choir, and the engineer who can't fix his own face. We're a regular pair of scrap heap rejects, aren't we? She reached out, her cool fingers grazing the scar on my neck. Is that how you see yourself? As scrap? I pulled back slightly, my defense mechanisms kicking in. Look, princess, let's focus on not getting smoked. We need to reach the sub-level junction. If we can get to the waste processing tunnels, we can navigate all the way to the docking bays in the outer ring. It's going to be a hard burn, and it's going to be filthy. I am not afraid of the dark, Kalen Vance, she said, her voice regaining that royal steel. I have lived in it my entire life. We moved through the cooling trunk, ducking under steaming pipes and shimmying through gaps that were clearly not designed for human or royal passage. My jumpsuit was quickly covered in a film of grease and gray dust, and Serene's white tunic was a lost cause. She didn't complain once, even when her hand slipped and she barked her shin against the titanium strut. Talk to me, she said as we paused at a junction to let a maintenance bot roll past. Tell me about this station. You talk about it as if it is a living thing. It is, I muttered, checking the pressure gauge on a nearby valve. 6 kilometers of pressurized metal, 3 million tons of shielding, and enough electrical wiring to wrap around a small moon twice. People think the spire is this grand monument to diplomacy, but it's really just a giant lung held together by a few thousand gearheads like me. If I stop turning these valves, everybody stops breathing. It's simple, logical. And you prefer things that are simple? I prefer things I can understand. You give me a ruptured seal, I can fix it. You give me a malfunctioning AI, I can recode it. But people are unpredictable. They make declarations of eternal bonding because of a smile. They start wars over genetic sequences. There's no manual for that, Serene. Perhaps, she said softly, you have spent so much time fixing the station that you forgot how to live in it. I didn't have an answer for that. I opened the hatch to the waste processing tunnels and the smell hit us like a physical blow, a mix of fermented nutrients and chemical stabilizers. Welcome to the bowels of the beast, I said, offering her a hand. Watch your step. The floor is slick, and if you fall into the sluice, you're going to have a very bad day. We were halfway through the tunnel when the lights flickered and died. The hum of the station changed, shifting from a steady thrum to a low, ominous groan. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. They've cut the power to the sub-levels, I whispered. That means they've found the junction. We're cooked if we stay in this tunnel. Kaylin, Serene said, her voice trembling slightly. I hear them. I don't hear anything. Not with your ears. My resonance, it is spiking. They are close. Their intent. It is like cold iron in my mind. I grabbed my multi-tool and flicked on the small, high-intensity light. The narrow beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the damp walls. Okay, new plan. We bug out through the ventilation ducts. It's a tight squeeze, but it'll take us directly above the security barracks. If we can reach the armory, we might be able to find something more useful than a wrench. Lead the way, engineer, she said, and for the first time I saw her smile. It wasn't radiant or certain. It was small, shaky, and absolutely terrified. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. As we climbed into the duct, I realized that I wasn't just trying to save a princess anymore. I was trying to save the only other person in the galaxy who knew what it felt like to be a mistake. And for some reason, that felt more important than all the bioscrubbers and atmospheric processors in the universe. We crawled through the dark, the metal of the duct popping and groaning around us. I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic, irregular thumping in my ears. I kept thinking about that smile, the one that started all of this. It was a glitch, a tiny error in the grand design of my life. But as the darkness pressed in on us, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the glitch was the only part of me that actually worked. The ventilation ducts of the Argent Spire were never meant for human transit, let alone for a high-born Xylosian princess who likely spent her mornings being dressed by a dozen servants. The space was only 60 centimeters wide, a claustrophobic tunnel of brushed aluminum that echoed every scrape of our knees and every ragged breath we took. The air was dry and tasted of copper, recycled so many times it felt thin and brittle in my lungs. Stay close, I whispered, the sound muffled by the acoustic padding of the duct. We're crossing over the main spine now. There's a 300-meter drop just past the next filter bank. If the magnets on your boots fail, don't scream. It'll just give the clackers a target. Clackers? Serene's voice came from behind me, surprisingly steady despite the circumstances. The purifiers. That's what we call them down in maintenance, because of the sound their armored boots make on the deck plates. Click-clack, click-clack, like the Grim Reaper in a fancy suit. A Grim Reaper with a genetic mandate, she added. I could hear the bitterness in her tone. They believe they are purifying the symphony. They think that by removing the dissonant notes, the song becomes more perfect. Sounds like a boring song to me, I muttered, dragging myself forward. My elbows were raw, and my jumpsuit was soaked with sweat. I've spent 15 years listening to the hum of this station. The most interesting parts are always the bits that don't quite fit. The rattling bearing, the flickering light, the valve that needs a little kick to stay open. That's where the character is. We reached the filter bank, a massive wall of rotating mesh that scrubbed the particulate matter from the air. The vibration was intense, a bone-deep shudder that made my teeth ache. I pulled myself onto a narrow ledge, reaching back to grab Serene's hand. As I pulled her up, the light from my multi-tool caught her face. She was pale, her silver hair matted with sweat and grease, but her eyes were burning with an intensity that made me feel like I was the one who was out of place. "Why are you doing this, Kaylin?" she asked suddenly. We were huddled on the ledge, the drop beneath us a terrifying void of shadows and humming machinery. "You could have stayed in the ballroom. You could have told the guards that I was a mad woman who had harassed you. They would have believed you. You would be safe in your bunk right now, dreaming of coolant flow rates." I looked down at the dark, then back at her. I thought about it. Believe me, for about 3 seconds, I was halfway to the exit. But then I looked at you, and I saw something I recognize. The resonance? No, I don't know anything about resonances or collective anthems. I saw a person who was being told they weren't enough, that they were a failure because they didn't fit into a box someone else built for them. I've lived that, Serene. I was born on a colony where your gen sequence determined your rations. My father was a miner. My mother was a scrub tech. My DNA was suboptimal before I was even out of the womb. They told me I'd never be more than a manual laborer, that I was a glitch in the system. I wiped a smudge of grease from my forehead. I've spent my whole life trying to prove them right by being the best damn glitch I could be. I fix the things the optimal people are too busy to notice. And when I saw you standing there, surrounded by all that gold and silver, looking like you wanted to scream but didn't have the voice, I couldn't just walk away. It would have been like leaving a broken circuit unfixed. It would have bothered me. Serene was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the rhythmic thrumming of the filters. You fix things because it bothers you when they are broken, she said softly. But what if I am not something that can be fixed, Kaylin? What if the silence in my soul is not a malfunction, but my true nature? Then maybe the silence is the point, I said, surprised by my own words. Maybe the galaxy is too loud anyway. Maybe it needs someone who knows how to listen to the quiet. I saw her swallow, her throat working. She reached out and touched my hand, her palm fitting perfectly against mine. For a heartbeat, the noise of the station seemed to fade away. There was a warmth there, a strange electric connection that felt more real than any of the sensors or gauges I had spent my life monitoring. It wasn't a biological mandate. It was just us. We need to move, I said, clearing my throat and breaking the moment. The security barracks are just through the next access hatch. If we can grab some gear and a long-range comm, we can try to contact the Earth Embassy. They might not be able to stop a Zalosian civil war, but they can sure as hell provide asylum for a kidnapped engineer. Kidnapped? She raised an eyebrow. In the official report, I was a victim of a royal abduction. It's better for my career prospects than voluntarily ran away with an alien princess into a sewer. We reached the hatch and I carefully unscrewed the locking bolts. I peered through the narrow gap into a dimly lit corridor. It was empty, but I could see the red flicker of an emergency beacon at the far end. This part of the station was on high alert. Stay behind me, I whispered. If anyone sees us, bug out back into the duct. Don't wait for me. I am tired of waiting, Kaylin Vance, she replied, her voice firm. We slipped out of the duct and into the hallway. The air here was colder, the walls lined with lockers and weapon racks. We were in the heart of the security zone. I led her toward the armory, my feet silent on the rubberized flooring. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the overhead speakers, distorted by static. Attention all personnel. The traitor Serene and the human accomplice have been sighted in the lower maintenance sectors. Authorized use of lethal force is now in effect. Repeat, lethal force is authorized. I felt my stomach drop. Well, I said, checking the charge on a stray stun baton I found on a bench. I guess that settles the diplomatic asylum question. We're officially KIA if they find us. Kaylin, look, Serene said, pointing toward a tactical display on the wall. The screen showed a map of the station, with red icons swarming toward the docking bays. They aren't just looking for us. They are seizing the transport ships. They are going to blockade the station. They're cutting us off, I realized. They don't just want to kill you. They want to take the spire. If they control the atmospheric processors, they control the life of every person on this station. They can hold 300,000 people hostage until the Ethelgard Council surrenders. I cannot let that happen, Serene said, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce light. The spire is neutral ground. It is a place of peace. Then we have to stop them from reaching the primary control hub, I said, my mind racing through the station's schematics. There's a junction in Sector 12. If I can get to the manual override, I can vent the cooling gas into the corridors. It won't kill them, but it'll drop the temperature to 40 degrees below zero in 10 seconds. It'll freeze their bio-augments and buy us enough time to lock down the core. Is that dangerous for you? I'll be in the control booth. It's shielded. But I need someone to hold the manual lever in the sub-corridor while I sync the codes. It's a two-person job. Serene looked at me, then at the map. I will be the other person. Princess, it's 40 degrees below zero. Your biology isn't built for that. You'll go into shock in minutes. And you were not built for a royal revolution, she countered. Yet here you are. I may not hear the anthem, Kaylin, but I can hear the heartbeat of this station when I am with you. I will not hide in a duct while you fight for my people. I looked at her, seeing the smudge of grease on her cheek and the fierce determination in her gaze. She was a mess. She was a glitch. She was perfect. Okay, I said, handing her a thermal cloak from one of the lockers. Wrap this around you. It's ugly, it's heavy, and it smells like a wet dog, but it'll keep your vitals above the red zone. She took the cloak, draping it over her ruined tunic with a grace that even filth couldn't hide. And you, Kalen, what will keep you safe? I patted the wrench at my belt and gave her that lopsided, broken smile. I've got the best insurance policy in the galaxy. I'm the guy who knows how to fix the mess. We moved out of the armory heading toward Sector 12. The station groaned around us, a titan in pain. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't just fixing a machine. I was part of the machine. And we were going to make sure the song continued, even if we had to write the notes ourselves. As we reached the heavy blast doors of the control hub, I paused, looking back at the long, dark corridor we had just traversed. I thought about the maintenance room I had started in, the solitary world of valves and gauges. It felt 1,000 light years away. I realized then that Serene was right. I had spent so long fixing things that I'd forgotten why they were worth fixing in the first place. It wasn't about the efficiency percentages or the pressure levels. It was about the people who breathed the air. It was about the glitches that made life unpredictable. It was about the silent princess who found her voice in the dark. "Ready?" I asked, my hand on the lever. "Ready," she replied, her hand covering mine. We pulled together, and the station screamed as the vents opened, a frozen white mist pouring into the hallways. It was the sound of a glitch becoming a revolution. And as the cold swept through the spire, I knew that whatever happened next, I was no longer just a guy fixing the lights. I was the light. The emergency venting of the cooling gas had turned Sector 12 into a crystalline nightmare of frozen vapor and brittle shadows. Every time I breathed, the air felt like it was carving tiny patterns into my throat with a jagged glass knife. I looked back at Serene, who was shivering so violently that I could hear the thermal cloak rattling against her frame. Her pale skin had taken on a translucent blue tint, making her look less like a princess and more like a ghost that had wandered out of a deep freeze unit. "You still with me, princess?" I whispered, my own breath blooming in front of my face like a miniature storm cloud. "Don't go dark on me now. We're almost to the ghost hub." "I am functional," she managed to say, though her teeth were chattering like a loose turbine blade. "But my internal regulators are struggling. My biology was not designed for sub-zero maintenance." "Most people aren't, Serene. That's why we have heaters and common sense. Usually." I adjusted my grip on her arm, pulling her closer to my side. My jumpsuit was reinforced for vacuum repairs, which meant I was slightly less miserable than she was, but my fingers were still losing sensation. We were navigating through a secondary bypass, a narrow corridor that smelled of frozen oil and metallic rot. The purifiers were likely frozen solid in the main hallways, their fancy bio-augments turned into heavy, useless lead by the sudden drop in temperature. It was a temporary fix, though. Once the automated systems detected the imbalance, they would flood the sector with heat to prevent the pipes from bursting. We had maybe 20 minutes before the hunters thawed out and came looking for the guy who had turned them into popsicles. "There," I said, pointing toward a heavy unmarked hatch at the end of the bypass. "The ghost hub. It's an old administrative node from the construction phase. It's not on the current digital maps because the brass thought it was a total wash 30 years ago. It's off the grid and shielded." I bypassed the lock with a manual override, and we tumbled inside. The air was stale but blessedly warm. As the hatch sealed shut, the sudden silence felt heavy, pressing against my ears with a physical weight. I helped Serene down onto a rusted metal bench and immediately went to work on the old power cell in the corner. "Watch your six, Kalen," Serene murmured, her eyes half closed. "Nobody's behind us, princess. We're deep six in the bowels of the station. Even the rats don't come down here." I stripped the insulation from a pair of heavy-duty wires and touched them to the backup heating coil. A shower of sparks sprayed across the floor, and a low orange glow began to emanate from the unit. It smelled like burning dust and ozone, but it was beautiful. I pulled Serene toward the heat, and for a few minutes we just sat there, listening to the creaking of the station as it expanded under the returning warmth of the main sectors. "You look like you've been through a recycler," I said, looking at her ruined tunic and the streaks of grease on her face. She let out a weak, melodic laugh. "I feel as though I have been disassembled and put back together by an amateur." Is this how you live, Kalen? Constantly at the edge of failure? Welcome to the human condition, princess. We're all just a bunch of glitches waiting to happen. The only difference is some of us are honest about it. I started rummaging through an old storage locker, looking for a medical kit or some nutrient bars. Instead, I found an ancient data tablet, its screen cracked and covered in a thick layer of grime. I wiped it off with my sleeve and tapped the power button. It flickered to life, the interface displaying a version of the biostandard that I had never seen before. It wasn't the polished, tiered system used by the current government. It was messy, full of cross-references and experimental data. "What is that?" Serene asked, her voice regaining some of its strength as the color returned to her cheeks. "It looks like a research log from the founding era. The Argent Spire wasn't built for diplomacy, Serene. It was built as a lab." I scrolled through the files, my heart hammering against my ribs. There were hundreds of folders, all labeled with human and Xylosian genetic codes. I searched for a specific marker, the one my father had told me made us unoptimal. I found it in a subdirectory titled The Resonance Contingency. "My people? They told me the biostandard was a natural evolution," Serene whispered, peering over my shoulder. "A way to bring harmony to the chaos of life. But this looks like a blueprint for control." "Ah, it's worse than that," I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "Look at these dates. The resonance wasn't a discovery. It was an invention. Your people didn't find a way to hear the collective anthem. They engineered it. They used human genetic static as a grounding frequency to stabilize the Xylosian nervous system. We weren't just laborers. We were the circuit breakers." The screen displayed a diagram of a human nervous system overlapping with a Xylosian one. Where the nerves crossed, there was a symbol, a jagged, lopsided smile. "The glitch," I said, my hand shaking. "The nerve damage in my face. It's not an injury, Serene. It's a dormant trait. My father had it. His father had it. It's a genetic marker for the original resonators. We were the ones who could bridge the gap between the silence and the song without losing ourselves." Serene reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the screen. "Then the purifiers. They aren't just hunting us because of a diplomatic scandal. They are hunting you because you are a walking piece of evidence. You are proof that their perfect symphony is a fabricated lie." I sat back, the weight of the revelation crushing the air out of my lungs. All my life, I had felt like a mistake, a piece of scrap that didn't fit into the gleaming machinery of the future. I had spent 32 years hiding my flaws, trying to be invisible, trying to be optimal enough to just survive. And now it turned out that my flaws were the only thing that was real. "I'm not a hero, Serene," I said, looking at my grease-stained hands. "I'm just a guy with a wrench who knows how to fix a leak. I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want to be a revolution. I just want to go back to my bunk and pretend none of this happened." Serene stood up, her movements still shaky but her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce clarity. She took the data tablet from my hands and set it on the bench. Then she took both of my hands in hers. "Kalen Vance, you have spent your life fixing the station because you hate to see things broken. But look around you. The galaxy is broken. My people are living in a dream that is actually a prison, and you are the only one who can see the cracks in the walls. I can't fix a galaxy, Serene. I don't have the parts for that. You have the frequency," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The silence in my soul. It wasn't a defect. It was a refusal to hear the lie. And when I saw you smile, I didn't just see a man. I saw the truth. I saw the frequency of a soul that is free because it is imperfect." She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. The ozone smell of the heater was replaced by the ozone scent of her energy field, but it wasn't cold this time. It was warm, vibrant, and full of a million tiny sparks. "Don't scrap yourself yet, engineer," she murmured. "We have a lot of work to do." I closed my eyes, feeling the static in my blood. For the first time in my life, the buzzing in my head didn't feel like noise. It felt like a signal, a call to action that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to hide in the dark. "Fine," I muttered, a small, lopsided grin tugging at the corner of my mouth. "But if we die, I'm filing a formal complaint with the maintenance department. The paperwork will be a nightmare." "I expect nothing less," she replied, her smile radiant and certain. We spent the next hour preparing. I raided the Ghost Hub's ancient supply of tools, finding a pair of high-frequency pulse emitters that hadn't been touched in 3 decades. They were clapped out and half dead, but with a little bypass wiring and some luck, they could act as portable jammers. If the purifiers tried to use their sonic harmonizers on us, we could blast them with enough genetic static to scramble their brains. We need to reach the central spine, I said, sketching a map on the dust-covered floor. That's where the primary broadcast array is. If we can upload the data from this tablet to the station's main feed, every Xylotian on the spire will hear the truth. The anthem will crack. And the purifiers? Serene asked. They'll be waiting for us. Valerius isn't going to let his perfect world crumble without a fight. He's probably got every soldier on the station guarding the core. Then we shall have to be very loud, she said, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the heater. As we prepared to leave the sanctuary of the Ghost Hub, I looked one last time at the ancient tablet. I thought about the thousands of people on this station. Humans like me, Xylotians like Serene, all of them trying so hard to be perfect, to be optimal, to fit into a system that saw them as numbers on a ledger. I realized then that the cost of not learning this lesson, of not accepting our flaws, wasn't just personal. It was a collective tragedy. We were all dying of a perfection that didn't exist. Let's go, I said, gripping my wrench like it was a scepter. Time to show them what a real glitch looks like. We stepped out into the corridor, the heat from the main sector already beginning to seep back into the sublevels. The hunt was back on, but for the first time, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the one coming to fix the machine. And this time, I wasn't going to stop until the whole thing was running on the truth. The climb toward the central spine was a journey through the vertical guts of the Argent Spire. We avoided the main lift shafts, opting instead for the gravity ladders that the maintenance crews used to bypass the diplomatic sectors. Every 100 meters, the air pressure shifted, and the sounds of the station changed. Below us, the industrial hum of the recyclers. Above us, the melodic artificial chimes of the elite residential rings. Keep your head on a swivel, I whispered as we reached the midpoint of the spine. We're entering the high-gen zones. The security here isn't just bots and cameras, it's biometrics. If the scanners pick up my suboptimal sequence, the whole floor goes into lockdown. Then we must be fast, Serene said. She was moving with a new kind of grace, not the practiced poise of a princess, but the fluid efficiency of someone who had found her purpose. The thermal cloak was still draped over her shoulders, but she had discarded the ruined tunic, revealing a sleek, dark undersuit that made her look like a shadow in motion. We reached the entrance to Sector 9, the buffer zone before the core. The lights here were a soft, pulsing blue, synchronized to the heartbeat of the station. As we stepped into the hallway, I felt a strange pressure in my ears. It wasn't atmospheric. It was a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. The harmony field, Serene whispered, her hand going to her throat. They've activated it. It's a subaudible frequency designed to keep the populace in a state of passive compliance. It feels like a heavy blanket over my mind. I stopped, closing my eyes. I could feel the hum, but it didn't feel like a blanket. It felt like static on a radio. It was annoying, like a buzzing fly that you couldn't quite catch, but it didn't paralyze me. My nerve damage, the glitch in my wiring, was acting like a surge protector. The signal was hitting my brain and shattering into a million pieces before it could take hold. I'm fine, I said, looking back at Serene. She was swaying on her feet, her eyes glazed. Serene, eyes on me. I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. Don't listen to the song. Listen to me. Focus on the static. Focus on the jagged bits. She gasped, her irises flickering as she fought the field. It is so beautiful, Kaylin. It tells me that I am loved, that I am part of something perfect, that I don't need to struggle anymore. It's a lie, princess. It's a digital sedative. If you give in, you're just another part in the machine. Is that what you want? To be a gear? The word gear seemed to snap her back. She blinked, the glassy look in her eyes fading. No, I am not a gear. I am a glitch. That's my girl. Now hold on to my belt. I can move through this, but you need to stay anchored to me. My biology is acting like a jammer. We moved down the long, curving corridor of Sector 9. We passed a group of human stewards standing perfectly still, their faces wearing expressions of serene, terrifying emptiness. They were optimal now. They were perfectly in sync with the anthem. It made my skin crawl. This was the cost of perfection, the total erasure of the self. There, I pointed to a heavy set of blast doors at the end of the hall. The core access. But we can't go through the front. Valerius will have a firing squad waiting. We have to go through the plasma conduit. The plasma conduit? Serene asked, her voice hushed. Is that not where the station's energy is channeled? Exactly. It's a high-energy tube lined with magnetic containment fields. It's about 100 degrees in there, and if the magnets fail, we're vapor in 2 seconds. But because of the energy flux, the harmony field can't penetrate it. It's the only blind spot in the station security. I used my wrench to pry open the maintenance cover for the conduit. A blast of hot, ionized air hit me in the face, smelling of scorched copper and power. I'll go first, I said. Keep your hands on the insulated pads. If you touch the walls, you'll get a shock that'll fry your sensors. And for the love of all things mechanical, don't trip. I crawled into the tube, the blue light of the plasma core pulsing rhythmically around us. It was like being inside the throat of a dragon. The heat was intense, making the sweat pour down my back in rivulets. My lungs burned with every breath, but the buzzing in my head was gone. Here, in the heart of the machine's power, there was only the raw, chaotic energy of existence. We crawled for 20 minutes, my muscles screaming in protest. Every time a pulse of plasma went through the main line, the conduit would vibrate, and the magnetic fields would shriek with a high-pitched whine. I looked back at Serene. She was struggling, her face flushed red, but she was keeping pace. She wasn't a princess anymore. She was a survivor. Almost there, I gasped, reaching the exit hatch. I kicked it open and tumbled out onto a cold metallic floor. We were in the core observation deck. Below us, the primary broadcast array hung in the center of a massive spherical chamber, glowing with an intense violet light. Above us, the central spine stretched upward toward the stars. Stop right there, engineer. The voice was cold, precise, and horribly familiar. I looked up. Valerius was standing on the bridge above the array, flanked by 6 purifiers. He wasn't wearing armor. He was dressed in his formal diplomatic robes, looking as composed as if he were sitting down for tea. But his eyes, they were full of a terrifying holy zeal. You have caused a great deal of dissonance, Kalen Vance, Valerius said, his voice echoing through the chamber. A minor error that has grown into a systemic failure. It is regrettable. Regrettable? I spat, pulling Serene to her feet. You're brainwashing an entire station, Valerius. You're turning people into dolls so you can feel perfect. That's not diplomacy. That's a lobotomy. You do not understand the burden of leadership, Valerius replied, stepping closer to the edge of the bridge. The Xylosian people were dying in the chaos of their own emotions. The anthem gave them peace. It gave them purpose. And you represent everything that we fought to escape. The mess, the noise, the unpredictable rot of the human spirit. I like the rot, I said, gripping the data tablet in my left hand and my pulse emitter in my right. It keeps things interesting. Kill him, Valerius said, his voice flat. Save the princess if you can. If not, she is a failed sequence. We can always engineer another heir. The purifiers raised their weapons, long, sleek rifles that fired concentrated sonic bolts. I knew that if they hit us, our internal organs would turn to jelly before we could even scream. Serene, now! I yelled. I activated the pulse emitter. A wave of invisible, high-frequency static exploded from the device, hitting the purifiers like a physical wall. They stumbled, their own bio-augments reacting violently to the interference. At the same time, Serene let out a sound. Not a scream, but a long, resonant note that seemed to vibrate at the same frequency as the violet light below us. It was the first time I had ever heard her sing. It wasn't the perfect, melodic song of the Xylosian people. It was jagged, raw, and full of pain. It was the sound of a silent soul finding its voice. The violet light of the array flickered. The harmony field wavered. The data! Serene shouted over the roar of the static. Kalen, upload the data! I lunged for the main console at the edge of the observation deck. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the firewalls that Valerius had built to protect his lie. I could feel the purifiers recovering, their sonic bolts whistling past my head, shattering the glass of the observation deck. "Come on, you piece of junk," I hissed, my hands shaking. "Don't choke on me now." The progress bar on the screen crawled forward. 10%, 20. A sonic bolt hit the console next to my hand, showering me in sparks and molten plastic. I felt a searing pain in my arm, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. This was the one thing I had to fix. The only thing that mattered. "Kalen!" Serene's voice was full of terror. I looked up. One of the purifiers had bypassed the static and was lunging toward me with a vibrating blade. I didn't have time to move. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. But the blow never came. Serene had thrown herself in front of me, her thermal cloak acting as a shield. The blade sliced through the fabric, grazing her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She grabbed the purifier's arm, her eyes glowing with that intense violet light. "I am the blood of Xylos," she hissed, her voice echoing with a power I had never heard before. "And I say the song is over." She shoved the soldier back, sending him tumbling over the edge of the observation deck. At that exact moment, the progress bar hit 100%. "Done!" I yelled. "It's out! The whole station has the files." Suddenly, the speakers throughout the chamber, and likely the entire spire, didn't emit the anthem. Instead, they emitted the sound of the ghost hub, the sound of sparks hitting a metal floor, the sound of a lopsided smile, the sound of the truth. The purifiers stopped. They dropped their weapons, their hands going to their heads as the harmony field shattered. On the bridge above us, Valerius let out a cry of rage, but he was drowned out by the noise of the station waking up. The silence was gone, replaced by the beautiful, messy, chaotic sounds of 300,000 people realizing they were free. But the cost was high. I looked at Serene, who was slumped against the console, her shoulder bleeding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had given everything to break the song. "Serene," I whispered, pulling her into my arms. Did they hear it?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "Yeah," I said, a tear tracing a path through the grease on my face. "They heard it. The whole galaxy heard the glitch." She smiled then, a real, honest, imperfect smile, and as the station's alarms began to blare, signaling the arrival of the Earth Embassy ships, I knew that the world would never be optimal again. And for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. The silence that followed the shattering of the harmony field was not peaceful. It was a jagged, screaming thing. Throughout the Argent Spire, 300,000 souls were suddenly thrust back into the raw, unbuffered reality of their own emotions. For the Zalosians, it was like a physical assault. The artificial peace they had known for generations, replaced by the stinging heat of anger, the hollow ache of grief, and the paralyzing weight of fear. For the humans, the optimal conditioning snapped like a dry twig, leaving them gasping on the floor, clutching their heads as memories and suppressed anxieties flooded back into their consciousness. The station itself seemed to be having a nervous breakdown. Without the steadying pulse of the harmony field, the bio-integrated systems began to drift. Lights flickered in erratic patterns, the gravity plating hummed at a discordant frequency, and the environmental scrubbers began to pump air that tasted of copper and ozone. "Kalen," Serene whispered. She was leaning heavily against the master console, her hand pressed to the jagged tear in her shoulder. The violet glow in the room was fading, replaced by the harsh, strobing red of emergency klaxons. "The song, it didn't just stop, it broke." "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you build a skyscraper on a foundation of lies, Princess," I said, my voice rasping. I was trying to wrap a piece of discarded thermal padding around my burned arm, but my fingers were shaking too much to tie the knot. "The whole station is rejecting the change. Valerius didn't just use that field for mind control, he tied the entire operating system to it. It's like he hardwired the station's brain to a sedative. Now the sedative is gone, and the patient is going into a grand mal seizure." I looked at the tactical display. Red icons were blooming across the map like a viral infection. Sector 9 was a total wash. The docking bays were experiencing atmospheric fluctuations. And worse, the primary reactor core, the beating heart of the spire, was beginning to show signs of thermal runaway. "He's going to let it burn," I muttered, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. If he can't have his perfect little ant farm, he's going to vent the whole thing into Ouroboros. "We have to stop him," Serene said, pushing herself away from the console. She winced, her face pale, but her eyes were hard. "The people, they are lost, Kalen. I can hear them. Not the anthem, but their voices. They are terrified." "They're human now," I said, finally managing to secure the bandage. "Or close enough. Welcome to the club. It's loud, it's messy, and it hurts like hell." I grabbed my pulse emitter and checked the power cell. It was down to 15%. "We need to get to the primary reactor core. If I can manually decouple the biointegration locks, I can reset the station to a standard mechanical override. It'll be clunky, and the air might taste like a wet dog for a week, but the station won't explode. And Valerius, he'll be there. A guy like that doesn't just run. He's going to be at the center of the mess, trying to glue the pieces back together or smashing the rest of them." We stepped out of the observation deck and into a corridor that looked like a war zone. Not because of bombs or lasers, but because of the people. Groups of Xylosians were huddled together, some weeping, others staring at their hands as if they had never seen them before. A human security officer was sitting on the floor, his helmet off, repeatedly saying the name of a daughter he had forgotten for 10 years. "Don't stop," I told Serene, though I could see she wanted to go to every one of them. "We saved the station. We saved them. If we don't move, they're all dusted." "Dusted," she repeated, the slang tasting strange on her tongue. "Yes, we must move." As we navigated the stairwells, avoiding the elevators that were now death traps of erratic gravity, the station let out a low, mournful groan. A structural support beam in the central spine had buckled. The vibration nearly threw us off the ladder. "Talk to me, Kalen," Serene said, her voice strained. "Tell me one of your engineering stories. Something to drown out the noise in my head." "Engineering stories? You want to hear about the time I spent 36 hours in a waste pipe because a sensor failed? It's not exactly a fairy tale, princess. Tell me anyway." "Fine. When I was 22, I worked on a freighter called the Rusty Bolt. Living up to its name, obviously. We were hauling grade D fuel rods when the magnetic containment started to flicker. Everyone was panicking, screaming about evacuation. But the captain, this old guy with one eye and a permanent smell of cheap synthale, just sat there and told me to grab a hammer." "A hammer?" "Yeah, he told me that the machine wasn't failing because it was broken. It was failing because it was scared. He said every machine has a soul made of math and friction, and sometimes you just have to remind it who's boss." So I crawled into the containment unit with the magnets screaming at me, and I hit the regulator housing as hard as I could. I didn't fix the math. I just disrupted the error. The machine reset, the magnets held, and we made it to the next port. I looked at her as we reached the heavy bulkhead of the reactor core. "Point is, Serene, being perfect is brittle. If you're perfect, one mistake ruins everything. But if you're a mess, if you're held together by hammers and luck, you're resilient. You know how to handle a blow because you've been taking them your whole life." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "I think I am beginning to like your hammers, Kalen Vance." "Good, because we're going to need a big one for this." The doors to the reactor core were already open. Inside, the chamber was a cathedral of light and sound. The primary core, a massive sphere of contained antimatter, was pulsing with an angry, unstable orange light. Arcs of static electricity danced across the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of scorched insulation. In the center of the bridge, overlooking the core, stood Valerius. He looked different now. The sleek, composed diplomat was gone. He had interfaced himself directly into the main terminal, cables snaking from the back of his neck into the station's architecture. His skin was flushing a deep, angry purple, and his eyes were glowing with a frantic, overcharged energy. "It is not ending," he screamed, his voice amplified by the station's speakers. "I can realign the frequencies. I can bring back the song. I just need more processing power." "Valerius, stop!" Serene shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the core. "Look at yourself. You're not leading them. You're consuming them. You're turning the spire into a tomb." It is a temple, Valerius countered, his head jerking with a series of neurological tics. A temple of order. You brought the chaos, princess. You brought the human rot into my garden. I will purge it. I will purge all of it. He slammed a hand onto the console, and a series of emergency vents opened. High-pressure steam hissed into the room, obscuring our vision. Through the mist, I saw the purifiers, the ones who hadn't been paralyzed by the field collapse, moving toward us. They were moving strangely, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Valerius was controlling them directly now, using his own brain as a hub for their augments. He's overclocking them, I hissed, pulling Serene behind a primary coolant tank. They're going to burn out in 5 minutes, but they'll rip us apart before then. We need to get to the manual override at the base of the core. I will draw their fire, Serene said, her hand going to the pulse emitter I had given her. You are the only one who knows the override sequence, Kalen. Go, now. Serene, no, that's suicide. Those guys are biotanks. They are puppets, she said, looking me in the eye. And I am a glitch. Remember? I have spent my life in the silence. I know how to move through the gaps in their song. Before I could argue, she vaulted over the tank, her thermal cloak fluttering behind her. She didn't run like a soldier. She moved like a dancer, weaving through the steam with a fluid, unpredictable grace. She fired the pulse emitter, not at the soldiers, but at the overhead lights, plunging the room into a chaotic strobe of shadow and fire. The purifiers turned, their heavy weapons discharging with a sound like thunder. I didn't watch. I couldn't. I dropped to the floor and began to crawl toward the base of the reactor sphere. The heat was incredible. Every breath felt like I was inhaling liquid lead. My skin was blistering, and the sweat in my eyes made everything a blur of orange and red. I reached the manual override panel, a heavy lead-lined box bolted to the core's support structure. I smashed the glass with my wrench and grabbed the heavy iron lever inside. This was it, the big hammer. But as I pulled, nothing happened. The lever was locked. Override denied, a cold, synthesized voice announced. Biosync mismatch. Sequence is non-optimal. I screamed a curse that would have made a docker blush. Non-optimal? You're about to melt down, you piece of junk. I'm the only one here trying to save you. I looked up. On the bridge, Valerius was laughing. You cannot fix this, engineer. The system knows its masters. It knows the shape of perfection. You are nothing but static. I looked at the console. The biosync lock was a glowing plate of crystal designed to read the genetic harmony of a Zaloshan High Lord. It was looking for a perfect, steady frequency, a song. I looked at my hand, greasy, burned, and shaking with the tremors of a man who had been through hell. I thought about the ghost hub. I thought about the jagged smile. I thought about the silence in Serene soul. You want a song? I hissed, pressing my hand onto the crystal. I'll give you a song. It's called The Last Day of the Spire, and it's got a real messy bridge. I didn't try to be steady. I didn't try to be optimal. I let my fear, my anger, my exhaustion, and my desperate hope flow into the interface. I focused on the scar on my neck, on the feeling of the wrench in my hand, on the way Serene had looked at me in the dark. I leaned into the glitch. The crystal turned a muddy, flickering gray. The system shrieked. It was trying to categorize me, trying to find a box to put me in, but I was too noisy. I was too human. Conflict detected, the voice said, its tone wavering. Input, irregular, system, destabilizing. That's it, I whispered, gritting my teeth as a jolt of feedback ran up my arm. Come on, break for me. Realize that you don't have to be perfect. Just be functional. Suddenly the crystal shattered, not into pieces but into a new pattern, a web of cracks that looked like a map of 1,000 different stars. Override accepted, the voice said, now sounding strangely like a human woman's. Manual control enabled. Welcome, Engineer Vance. I grabbed the lever and pulled with every ounce of strength I had left. With a massive metallic thud that shook the entire station, the biolocks decoupled. The orange light of the core began to fade, shifting into a steady, manageable blue. The thermal runaway halted. The spire breathed. On the bridge, Valerius let out a scream of pure existential agony. The feedback from the system override hit his overcharged brain like a tidal wave. The cable snapped back, sparking, as he collapsed onto the deck. The purifiers dropped where they stood. The puppet's strings finally cut. The steam began to clear. I slumped against the reactor base, my heart hammering like a trapped bird. Kaylin! I looked up to see Serene running toward me. She was covered in soot, her cloak torn to shreds, and she was limping, but she was alive. She collapsed next to me, her silver hair spilling over my lap. "You did it!" she gasped, her eyes wet with tears. "You fixed the world." "No," I said, coughing up a lungful of smoke. "I just reminded it how to be a mess. The fixing part, that's going to take a lot longer." I looked at her, at the blood on her shoulder and the dirt on her face, and I realized that she had never looked more beautiful. She wasn't a princess of a perfect race anymore. She was just Serene, and she was enough. As the blue light of the reactor bathed us in a quiet glow, the station finally settled into a new rhythm. It wasn't a song, it was just a hum, a steady, resilient, and gloriously imperfect hum. The aftermath of a revolution is rarely as clean as the history books suggest. For the next 48 hours, the Argent Spire was a place of organized chaos. The Earth embassy ships had docked, bringing with them medical teams, engineers, and a small army of diplomats whose primary job was to look important, while the rest of us did the heavy lifting. Valerius was in custody, though custody was a loose term for a man whose mind had been fried by a feedback loop of his own making. He sat in a high-security cell, staring at the wall, occasionally whispering about the perfect frequency that no one else could hear. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a broken machine that couldn't be repaired. I was sitting in my old maintenance quarters, which had been declared a diplomatic sanctuary by Serene, much to the annoyance of the station's remaining bureaucrats. My arm was in a high-tech sling that hummed with a soothing, regenerative frequency, and I was drinking a cup of real earth coffee, no synth rubbish, just dark, bitter beans that tasted like home. There was a knock on the door. Not the polite chime of a diplomat, but the steady, solid knock of someone who knew exactly who was on the other side. "Come in," I said, not looking up from the data tablet where I was reviewing the station's structural integrity reports. Serene stepped into the room. She was wearing a simple gray jumpsuit, much like mine, though hers was clean and actually fit her. She had cut her hair short, the silver strands framing her face in a way that made her look younger, more vulnerable, and somehow more powerful. "You look like a tech," I said, a small smile tugging at my mouth. "I am learning," she replied, sitting on the edge of my desk. "Valerius used to say that the Vanguard were meant to be the architects of the soul, but I think I would rather be an architect of the air filters. It is more honest." "It's certainly more grease," I agreed. "How are the people?" "They are struggling. The silence is difficult for them. They have never had to manage their own emotions without a conductor. There is much anger, Kaylin, much blame. They look at the humans and they see the static that broke their world. And the humans look at the Zolosians and they see the jailers who stole their memories." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Yeah, that's the part they don't tell you about freedom. It's heavy. It's much easier to be a puppet. You don't have to worry about who to blame when everything goes sideways." "But there is hope," she said, her voice soft. "I spent the morning in the residential rings. I saw a Zolosian woman teaching a human child how to weave light sculptures. They were both clumsy, the patterns were uneven, but they were laughing. It was the most beautiful dissonance I have ever heard." She looked at me, her eyes deep and infinite. "We have much work to do, Kaylin. The Vanguard Council has been dissolved. A new provisional government is being formed. They want me to lead them." I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest. "A princess again, huh? Back to the gold and the silver?" "No," she said, reaching out to touch my uninjured hand. "Not a princess. A bridge. They want someone who knows what it feels like to be a glitch. Someone who has seen the truth behind the song." She paused, her fingers tracing the calluses on my palm. "They asked me who I would choose as my arch-consort. They expected me to name a high-gen diplomat from Earth or a reformed noble from the Outer Rim." I felt my breath hitch. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that I have already found my consort. I told them that I chose a man who fixes the world not because it is his duty, but because he cannot stand to see it broken." I told them I chose a man who taught me that a lopsided smile is more valuable than 1,000 perfect anthems. I looked away, my face flushing. Serene, I'm an engineer. I'm a zero rank. I spend my days covered in hydraulic fluid and arguing with maintenance bots. I don't know how to be a bridge. I don't know how to be whatever it is you need me to be. I don't need you to be anything other than what you are, Kaylin Vance, she said, her voice firm. I don't need a prince. I need a man with a hammer. I need someone who will tell me when I'm trying to be too perfect. I need someone who will help me listen to the quiet. I looked at her then, seeing the truth in her eyes. I realized that my whole life I had been running from my own flaws, thinking they made me less. I had tried to be invisible, thinking that my noise was a defect, but it was the noise that had saved the station. It was the glitch that had broken the lie. It was the scar on my neck and the tremor in my hand that had allowed me to bridge the gap between two worlds. My non-optimal life wasn't a mistake. It was a signature. It's going to be a total wash, I said, a tear escaping and tracing a path through the stubble on my chin. We're going to make 1,000 mistakes. We're going to argue. People are going to hate us. We're going to spend the next 50 years trying to fix things that will just break again the next day. Yes, she said, her smile radiant and certain. It will be glorious. I stood up, ignoring the ache in my arm, and pulled her into a hug. She felt solid, warm, and real. There was no resonance, no mystical bonding, no genetic mandate. There was just a man and a woman, standing in a small room on a battered space station, choosing each other because of their flaws, not despite them. Outside the viewport, the gas giant Ouroboros continued to swirl, a golden and violet masterpiece of atmospheric chaos. It was a world that had never known perfection, and it was beautiful. Okay, I whispered into her hair, but I'm keeping my wrench. I would not have it any other way, she laughed. As we stood there watching the stars, I knew that the Argent Spire was no longer a temple of order. It was something better. It was a home for the broken, a sanctuary for the noisy, and a laboratory for the most complicated engineering project in the galaxy, the human and Xylosian heart. We had spent our lives trying to be optimal, only to find that the only thing worth being was honest. The song was over, but the music was just beginning. And for the first time in 32 years, I knew exactly where I stood in the universe. I was right where I was supposed to be, a beautiful, messy glitch in a wide, wonderful galaxy. The 48 hours following the collapse of the Harmony field felt like 1,000 years squeezed into a single, frantic heartbeat. The Argent Spire was no longer a temple of silent order. It was a cacophony of raw, unvarnished existence. Without the synthetic sedative of the anthem, the station was vibrating with the sounds of 300,000 people rediscovering what it meant to feel. It was loud. It was messy. It was, as my old supervisor used to say, when a reactor went south, absolute foobar. I spent most of that time in the sub-levels, far away from the cameras and the Earth Embassy diplomats who were currently trying to figure out how to frame a planetary revolution as a minor administrative restructuring. My arm was still in a regenerative sling, pulsing with a low-frequency hum that felt like a warm cat purring against my skin, but I had enough mobility in my right hand to hold a diagnostic tablet. Kaylin, you're supposed to be in medical, Jax said, leaning against a rusted bulkhead. Jax was a fellow tech rat, a man who had spent 20 years in the bowels of the Spire and had the permanent grease stains under his fingernails to prove it. He was currently chewing on a piece of synthetic protein jerky, looking at me with a mix of awe and pity. The brass is looking for you. They want to put you on a commemorative coin or something. The man who broke the song. Sounds like a bad folk holovid. Let them look, I muttered, my eyes glued to the pressure readings for the Sector 7 oxygen scrubbers. Coins don't fix atmospheric imbalances, Jax, and if I don't recalibrate these sensors, the people in the residential ring are going to start breathing carbon dioxide by dinner time. Jax snorted, tossing a piece of jerky into his mouth. Always the engineer. You just saved the galaxy, or at least this corner of it, and you're worried about the scrubbers. You're a real piece of work, Vance. You know the purifiers are being processed in the holding bays? Half of them don't even remember why they were trying to smoke us. It's like their brains were hardwired to Valerius's ego, and now that he's unplugged, they're just lost. They aren't lost, I said, finally looking up. They're just quiet. They've never had an original thought in their lives, Jax. Imagine waking up at 30 years old and realizing you don't actually know what your favorite color is because the system always chose it for you. That's not a malfunction. That's a tragedy. I felt a sharp pang of empathy for the soldiers I had been fighting only 2 days ago. We were all victims of the biostandard in our own way. Some of us were told we were scrap, and others were told they were masterpieces, but neither of us were allowed to be people. Serene is with them, Jax added, his voice softening. In the holding bays. She's been there for 10 hours. No guards, no royal entourage. Just her, talking to them. I saw it on the internal feed. She's not acting like a princess, Kaelin. She looks like you. Tired, dirty, and stubborn as a mule. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with the heater. She's a fast learner. She's a glitch, Jax corrected with a grin. Just like us. The whole station is a glitch now. And honestly, it's the first time this place has felt like it wasn't made of plastic. He was right. As I walked through the corridors toward the main engineering hub, I saw the transformation. It was painful to watch, but it was real. I saw a Zalosian noble sitting on a bench, staring at a human maintenance worker who was explaining how to use a manual water dispenser. There was no telepathic resonance, no collective harmony. Just two individuals struggling to communicate across a void of cultural baggage. It was awkward. It was full of misunderstandings and flared tempers. It was perfect. I stopped at the viewport overlooking the central spine. The violet light of the core was gone, replaced by the steady utilitarian blue of a standard fusion reaction. I could see the Earth Embassy ships, sleek white vessels that looked like predatory birds, hovering near the docking pylons. They were here to stabilize the situation, which usually meant ensure the trade routes stay open. But the Spire wasn't a trade route anymore. It was a laboratory for a new kind of existence. I reached the main hub and found Serene waiting for me. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her gray jumpsuit was covered in the dust of the holding bays. But when she saw me, she didn't give me a royal nod. She didn't offer a telepathic greeting. She just walked up and leaned her head against my shoulder. "They are starting to remember," she whispered. "The soldiers." One of them told me about a dream he had when he was a child. He wanted to be a gardener. He'd forgotten it for 20 years because his genetic profile said he was a warrior. He cried, Kaelin. He cried for an hour because he'd lost so much time. "We've all lost time, Serene," I said, putting my good arm around her. "But we've got plenty of it now. That's the thing about being broken. You get to decide how you want to put the pieces back together." "Valerius wants to see me," she said, pulling back slightly. "The medical team says his neural pathways are stabilizing, but his mind is fractured. He keeps asking for the conductor. He can't handle the silence." "He doesn't have to," I said. "He just has to learn to live in it, like the rest of us." I realized then that my journey wasn't about defeating a villain or saving a princess. It was about realizing that the biostandard was a prison I had built for myself, just as much as Valerius had built it for the Zalosians. I had spent my life thinking my flaws were a sign of failure, when they were actually the only thing that made me resilient. I was a survivor because I was non-optimal. I was strong because I had been broken before. "I have to go to the High Chamber," Serene said, straightening her jumpsuit. "The Provisional Council is meeting. They want to discuss the new constitution. They want to know if we should keep the biostandard as a voluntary guideline." I looked at her, my lopsided smile appearing without me even thinking about it. "You know what my vote is." "Scrap it," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Exactly. Scrap the whole thing. If a part doesn't fit, you don't throw it away. You change the machine." As she walked away, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in 32 years. The station was still a mess. The politics were going to be a nightmare. The Earth ambassadors were probably going to try to tax the air we breathed. But for the first time, the princess problem wasn't a problem at all. It was a partnership. I turned back to my diagnostic tablet. There was a leak in Sector 9 that needed my attention. It was a small, annoying, persistent problem. I couldn't wait to fix it. 1 year later, the Argent Spire was unrecognizable. The polished obsidian floors were gone, replaced by durable, recycled polymer that could withstand the heavy boots of the thousands of new settlers who had flocked to the station. The gala was no longer a formal exercise in interstellar vanity held once a year. It had been replaced by the open markets, a perpetual, chaotic festival of trade, art, and music that spilled out of the grand atrium and into the maintenance tunnels themselves. I was no longer just Kalen Vance, maintenance tech third class. I was the chief of infrastructure, a title that sounded much grander than it actually was. Mostly, it just meant I had more people to argue with when the waste recyclers got backed up. I stood on the bridge of the central spine, looking out at Ouroboros. The gas giant was as indifferent as ever, its golden storms churning in a silent, beautiful dance. But inside the station, the music was different. It wasn't the anthem. It was 1,000 different sounds. The clatter of tools, the laughter of children, the heated debates of the council, and the quiet humming of people who were finally comfortable in their own skin. Serene walked onto the bridge, her footsteps confident on the deck plates. She wasn't wearing a jumpsuit today. She was wearing a simple, elegant robe of earth silk, dyed the color of a deep space nebula. She looked like a leader, but more importantly, she looked happy. "The Earth delegation is leaving," she said, joining me at the viewport. "Ambassador Chen told me that our experiment in radical self-governance is a fascinating anomaly. He also said he's never tasted better coffee than the blend they're roasting in Sector 4. "That's because it's roasted in a repurposed heat exchange unit," I said, grinning. "Gives it a bit of a metallic kick. Very optimal for the working man." Serene laughed, and the sound was like music, real music, full of flaws and character. She reached out and took my hand. We had been married for 6 months. It wasn't a royal bonding or a genetic merger. It was a simple ceremony held in the Ghost Hub, witnessed by Jax, a dozen maintenance techs, and a very confused but supportive Earth ambassador. "They want to build a monument, Kalen," she said, "in the center of the atrium. To commemorate the revolution, they asked for our input on the design." I looked at the viewport, my reflection staring back at me. My scar was still there, a jagged line on my neck. My lopsided smile was as crooked as ever. I looked like a guy who had spent too much time under a fusion core. "Tell them to build a mirror," I said. "A mirror?" "Yeah, but not a perfect one. Tell them to build it out of 1,000 different shards of glass and metal. Make it jagged. Make it uneven. So when people look into it, they don't see a perfect version of themselves. They see the truth. They see the glitch." Serene squeezed my hand. "The architecture of the heart. I like it." We stood there for a long time, watching a freighter dock at the outer ring. It was a battered old ship, covered in carbon scoring and mismatched hull plates. It looked like a mess. It looked like us. I thought back to that night at the gala 1 year ago. I thought about the fear I had felt when Serene first smiled back at me. I thought about how much I had wanted to run, to hide in my bunk and pretend that I was just a cog in a machine that didn't care about me. I realize now that the most dangerous thing about the biostandard wasn't the genetic engineering or the telepathic control. It was the lie that we are only valuable when we are perfect. I spent 32 years of my life trying to fix myself, trying to fill in the gaps and smooth over the rough edges, thinking that if I could just be optimal, I would finally be happy. But happiness isn't the absence of flaws. It's the acceptance of them. It's realizing that the scar on my neck is a map of where I've been, and my lopsided smile is a sign of a heart that has survived the storm. We aren't machines to be calibrated. We are stories to be told. And every story needs a bit of static, a bit of noise, to make the melody worth hearing. The spire is still standing not because it's perfect, but because it's resilient. It's held together by millions of tiny imperfect connections that choose to hold on every single day. And that choice, that messy, human, beautiful choice, is the only anthem I ever want to hear again. I looked at Serene, and she was looking back at me. She didn't need a resonance to know what I was thinking. She could see it in my eyes. "Kalen," she whispered. "Yeah, princess?" "I'm glad you didn't fix your face." I laughed, pulling her close. "Me too, Serene. Me too." As the sun of the Ouroboros system rose over the horizon of the gas giant, casting a long golden light across the bridge, I realized that I was finally done running. I was no longer a glitch in the system. I was the system. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the next failure, because I knew that whatever broke, we would fix it together, one piece at a time. For so long, I thought my value was tied to how well I could mimic a perfect machine, hiding the parts of me that didn't fit. I wonder, as you look at your own reflection, what part of yourself have you been trying to fix that actually makes you who you are? Is it the scar, the mistake, or the jagged edge that finally lets the light in? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old battered wrench, placing it on the console. It was scratched, dented, and completely non-optimal. It was exactly what the world needed.